They said slavery ended. They said the chains were broken. But what if those chains never really came off, just changed shape? Today, the United States holds more prisoners than any country in the world, and hidden behind the bars is an economy built on labor, cheap, invisible, and brutally familiar. From cotton fields to prison yards, from auction blocks to booking numbers, the same system that once sold bodies for profit now rents them by the hour. It's a cycle that never truly stopped, only rebranded. Once they called it slavery, now they call it justice. This is the untold story of how America turned human bondage into business. Again, the story of how the plantation became the prison and how freedom was rewritten into a contract. This is the prison economy, from slave labor to mass incarceration. When the Civil War ended in 1865, the world believed a great evil had finally been defeated. Enslaved men and women once treated as property were now declared free. But freedom in America came with fine print. The South was in ruins, its wealth destroyed, its plantations empty. And so, the same men who once owned slaves began to ask a question. How do you rebuild an empire when your labor force has disappeared? The answer came quietly, almost legally. In 1865, the same year slavery was abolished, the 13th Amendment was passed. It declared that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist, except as a punishment for crime. That single phrase, except as a punishment for crime, became the loophole that rebuilt slavery from the ashes. Almost overnight, Southern states began passing laws known as Black Codes. These laws made everyday survival illegal for freed Black Americans. Loitering, not having proof of employment, breaking curfew, or even speaking too loudly could lead to arrest. The goal wasn't justice, it was labor. The prisons filled quickly, and when the cells overflowed, states found a new way to profit: convict leasing. Freed men and women, now labeled as criminals, were leased out to private companies: railroads, coal mines, lumber yards, and plantations. They were worked to death under conditions often worse than slavery, because now there was no need to protect an investment. In the words of one Mississippi official, "Before we owned the Negroes. Now we just rent them." From 1865 to the early 1900s, the convict leasing system became one of the South's most profitable industries. States made millions by selling prisoner labor to corporations. Prisoners built railroads, harvested cotton, mined coal, and laid the infrastructure of the modern South, all while chained, starved, and beaten. At the center of this horror stood the plantation prisons, places like Parchman Farm in Mississippi or Angola Prison in Louisiana. These weren't just prisons. They were plantations reborn. Prisoners, mostly Black men, were forced to pick cotton under armed guards wearing uniforms instead of rags, serving sentences instead of ownership papers. The overseers were now wardens. The whips remained the same. By the turn of the 20th century, the South's economy had fully adapted. Slavery had ended in name, but not in function. The state no longer sold people, it rented them. Every arrest, every sentence, every conviction became currency. When activists began questioning this system, they were met with a familiar argument. These are criminals, not slaves. But deep down, everyone knew the truth. The vast majority of those imprisoned weren't dangerous. They were poor Black and trapped in a legal system designed to keep them there. By the 1920s, over 90% of prisoners in the South were African American. Yet Black people were never 90% of the population. The math didn't add up unless you saw it for what it was: the continuation of racial control by another name. And behind this machine were politicians, lawyers, and corporations who called it progress. They argued that the system was efficient, that it taught discipline, provided order, and rebuilt the economy. In reality, it was Slavery 2.0, cleaned up, codified, and perfectly legal. As the decades passed, America's industrial engine grew stronger, and so did its appetite for labor. Even northern industries began to rely on prison contracts. Factories used inmate labor to manufacture furniture, uniforms, and machinery. The prisoners were paid nothing or a few cents an hour. The profits rolled in. In the 1970s, the phrase law and order became the new weapon. Politicians used it to frame poverty, addiction, and protest as crimes. The war on drugs, launched in the 1980s, exploded the prison population. Crack cocaine was criminalized harshly, especially in black neighborhoods, while the same drug in powder form, used by wealthier white Americans, carried lighter sentences. By the 1990s, America had entered the age of mass incarceration. In the 1930s, as the nation modernized, states began to phase out formal convict leasing. But the idea behind it, the idea that prisons could be profitable, never went away. It simply evolved. After World War II, America entered a new era of politics and fear. Civil rights movements rose, demanding justice, equality, and an end to racial segregation. But to those in power, equality threatened the old order, and so began a new war. This time not against slavery, but against the very communities that had survived it. The logic of the plantation was reborn in the boardroom. And just like the Old South, it was justified through law. Judges, politicians, and lobbyists worked together to maintain a steady supply of laborers through harsher sentencing laws, mandatory minimums, and three strikes policies. Every new law was another nail in freedom's coffin. By the end of the 20th century, America had built a prison empire, and inside it millions labored, making military uniforms, furniture, license plates, and even products for major corporations. The average wage, less than $1 an hour. Freedom had been redefined. Justice had been monetized. The same nation that once sold people now rented their time. Private prison corporations saw opportunity. If more prisoners meant more contracts, more government funding, and more labor, then why stop the flow? Prisons became investments. Each inmate a number, a dollar sign. The Corrections Corporation of America, CCA, now called Core Civic, and GEO Group began running prisons for profit. Their contracts guaranteed payment per prisoner, meaning the more inmates they held, the more money they made. Inside the prisons, a silent economy thrived. Inmates sewed military uniforms, built furniture for government offices, assembled electronics, and packaged food for major brands. Companies like Victoria's Secret, Starbucks, and Microsoft have all been tied, directly or indirectly, to prison labor at various points in history. Every product that left a prison workshop carried an invisible signature, made by the forgotten. The system called it rehabilitation. But the truth was profit. When the 21st century began, America's prison system wasn't just an institution, it was an industry. What started as a system of punishment had become a vast economic network powered by human confinement. By the early 2000s, more than 2 million people sat behind bars, more than any country on earth. The land of the free had turned captivity into commerce. Every aspect of imprisonment had a price tag. Prison phone calls cost up to $10 per minute. Basic hygiene products sold at inflated rates. Medical care was outsourced to for-profit companies that saved money by denying treatment. Families spent their life savings just to stay in touch with loved ones behind bars. In this world, even communication was a commodity. But perhaps the darkest part of this economy wasn't inside the prisons, it was the pipeline feeding them. For corporations, it was a goldmine. Prisoners worked for cents, sometimes 10 or 20 cents an hour, saving companies millions. The state benefited too. Cheap labor reduced public costs while generating revenue. Politicians could boast about reducing unemployment and cutting prison costs, while entire towns depended on prisons as their main employers. In some rural areas, prisons became economic lifelines. Factories closed, farms disappeared, and the only stable job left was guarding the incarcerated. Politicians realized that prisons weren't just punishment, they were politics. The more prisons built, the more jobs created, the more votes secured. And as construction companies, food vendors, and telecommunications firms joined in, incarceration became a full-scale industry. From the streets to the cells, the system was seamless. Police targeted poor neighborhoods with aggressive arrests. Courts imposed harsh sentences. Prisons filled, companies profited. When prisoners were finally released, many found themselves trapped in debt, jobless, and marked with a criminal record that made employment nearly impossible. For many, re-entry led straight back to incarceration. It wasn't rehabilitation, it was recycling. Private prison corporations and lobbying groups like ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, played a quiet but powerful role. They drafted laws that guaranteed steady prison populations, stricter drug sentences, longer parole restrictions, and immigration detention policies. These laws were then handed to politicians, often written word for word into state legislation. It was the perfect business model. Create the criminals you need to stay rich. By the 2010s, the numbers told the story clearly. Black Americans made up roughly 13% of the US population, but nearly 40% of the prison population. The same pattern echoed through history, from slave ships to slave codes to sentencing laws. In 2014, a UN report compared the US prison system to a form of modern slavery. It wasn't just about labor, it was about control. Entire communities were policed, imprisoned, and stripped of opportunity, generation after generation. And beneath it all was the same logic that once fueled slavery: human bodies as units of labor, profit, and control. The plantation had evolved into a prison, the overseer into a warden, the whip into a legal system. Some might argue this comparison is too harsh. But look closer. Both systems used race as a foundation. Both criminalized blackness. Both claimed to maintain order. And both turned human suffering into wealth. And when they are finally released, society brands them forever. Ex-convicts face barriers to voting, housing, and employment. Employers reject them. Landlords refuse them. Politicians use their records to silence them. They are free only on paper. This is how the prison economy sustains itself, not only by labor but by ensuring those who leave are destined to return. It's a loop as precise as any machine. To end it, we have to see it for what it is: the evolution of slavery into bureaucracy, of chains into paperwork, of ownership into management. The system doesn't need to call itself slavery, it behaves like it. To truly understand its power, you have to follow the money. For every inmate, the government pays private prisons an average of $70 to $100 per day. Multiply that by millions of inmates and you see why this system refuses to die. Every new law, every sentencing guideline, every crackdown on crime translates into billions of dollars. But beyond numbers and policies lies the human cost, the psychological weight of being turned into currency. Inside, prisoners are stripped not just of freedom but of purpose. Many never learn skills that will help them survive outside. Some spend years in solitary confinement, where silence replaces sunlight. The system creates dependence, then punishes it. And the story of America's prisons isn't a new chapter, it's a continuation. From cotton fields to concrete cells, the logic remains the same: control the poor, exploit the weak, and call it law. In 1865, the 13th Amendment promised freedom with one exception. Over a century later, that exception became the foundation of an empire. And so the prison gates remain open, not just to hold the guilty, but to feed an economy that thrives on captivity. They said slavery ended. But listen closely, the chains still echo. Only now they rattle behind walls we choose not to see. And yet amidst this darkness there are sparks of resistance. Former inmates have begun to organize, exposing the corporations that profit from their pain. Documentaries, lawsuits, and activists are forcing the public to confront the truth: that freedom in America still has a price tag. Grassroots movements now fight for prison abolition, restorative justice, and ending forced labor. They are asking the same question abolitionists asked 200 years ago: what does it mean to be free? But the power of the prison economy runs deep. Entire generations have been taught to equate punishment with safety, labor with discipline, and profit with justice. Breaking that illusion means confronting the truth most people want to ignore: that our comfort is often built on someone else's captivity.